In this lesson today, we're going to be looking at adding and subtracting rational expressions. Now, if you remember fractions, we always have to find common denominator before we can add or subtract. In the first example here, you will see that indeed we do have common denominator. Since we have common denominator, all we need to do is see if there's anything that we can combine on the top. We actually have like terms on the top. They're both b terms, so we can combine them, and that would be 8b divided by b squared. Now we have to remember how to simplify. We have one b on top. It cancels out one of the b's on the bottom, so you're simply left with 8 divided by b. So that was one of the easiest examples because we already had common denominator. Here's the process that we went through. Okay, again, we have common denominator, but there's something about this one that we need to remember. I like to write the denominator just once. We have a binomial minus a binomial. Now, if you remember, when subtracting with polynomials, we add the opposite of each term in the second polynomial. So we're going to add the opposite of a negative m would be a positive m, and the opposite of a positive 2 would be a negative 2. So we're going to rewrite those terms. I'm going to erase that because I have it on my PowerPoint highlighted. There's what we have to change. So notice I changed it to plus a positive m and a negative 2. Now, we have our common denominators already, so we're going to look for like terms in the top. We have a 3m and a 1m. We can combine those. We have a negative 6 and a negative 2. We can combine those. And when you do, you get 4m minus 8. And there's no need to have to write the denominator twice. We just write it once here. Now we go back to our previous lesson on simplifying. In order to simplify rational expressions, you're going to have to factor, factor, factor. So we look at the numerator. It's not the difference of two perfect squares, but we can pull out the greatest common factor, which would be 4. And if we divide each term by 4, you're left with m minus 2. That's factoring the numerator. For the denominator, we have a quadratic trinomial with a leading coefficient of 1. So we're going to use reverse FOIL. We think of factor pairs that multiply to get a negative 6, but add to get a positive 1. So when I factor that, that would be m minus 2 and m plus 3. That's something we've been doing a lot, so hopefully you remember how to do your reverse FOIL. Okay, so there's what I had. Now what can we simplify? The m minus 2's cancel each other out, so you're just left with 4 on the top and m plus 3 on the bottom. This next example is the first time that we have not had common denominator, so we have to create one. So look at the coefficients, 2 and 3. The common denominator would be 6. Then you pick the variable with the highest exponent, so that would be d cubed. Then we look at each denominator and ask ourselves, what do we have to multiply 3d by in order to get 6d cubed? I would have to multiply it times 2d. That would be 6d squared. Oh, d squared, because we need d cubed. So I have to multiply the top times 2d squared. And that's going to give us 8d squared. For the next denominator, we had 2d cubed. I have to multiply that times 3 in order to get 6d cubed. So I have to multiply this top times 3, and that would be minus 6d. Now again, we're going to try to simplify this. I'm going to erase this, let that PowerPoint pull it up. Kind of showed you how I would do that process. There's what we had to multiply each of them by. There's what we had. Now, I like to just write this denominator once. It looks confusing to me to write it twice, so I would just write that once like this underneath it all. Now we can factor in the numerator. So when we factor the numerator, we could pull out a 2d, and what would be left would be 4d minus 3. Here's what you see here. And there you see the denominator only written once. Now remember, when simplifying, this is a binomial. I cannot simplify anything unless I have an identical binomial to it. I do not have. Nothing I can simplify there. So outside of that polynomial, I can cross out the 2 and the 6, and the 6 becomes a 3. This d cancels out one of these d, so that leaves us with d squared on the bottom. So our final answer was 4d minus 3 divided by 3d squared. If you need to pause the video there so that you can look at those notes back at what we did, each of the processes there, you can do that. In our next example, let's look for a common denominator. We have 6 and 4, so the common denominator would be 12. And then we take the variable with the highest exponent, so we have 12x squared. So what do I multiply 6x squared to get 12x squared would be a 2. So I'm going to multiply the top term times 2. That would be 6x. And 4x has to be multiplied times 3x in order to get 12x squared. So we multiply the numerator also by 3x, and that would give us 6x squared. Let's see the thought process I go through to get that. Let the PowerPoint pull it up. Now again, I don't like writing this twice right here. I would just write it once on the bottom so it gets less confusing. All right, so now what we have, there I have it written once with the denominator. Factor, factor, factor. What can we factor out of the top? We can factor out a 6x, and if we divide each term by 6x, that would be 1 plus x on the top. And on the bottom, we still have 12x squared. So remember, we can't cancel anything out with an identical binomial there, but the 6 and the 12 becomes a 2, and the x takes away one of these x's, so we're left with 2x on the bottom. So we have 1 plus x divided by 2x. Again, if you need to pause the video there to look back at the steps that you see there on the PowerPoint, you can do that. Okay, this is actually the first one on your assignment today. No variables in the denominator, so it's simply our common denominator would be 21. So I have to multiply 7 times 3, so I also have to multiply my numerator times 3. That would be 12a. Nothing to change about the second one, it's just plus a. Notice on top we have like terms, so we can combine them. And 12a plus 1a would be 13a divided by 21. And that's your final answer. Not too difficult. Okay, let's look at another example from your assignment today. This one looks like it's number 3 on your paper. Common denominator would be 10. I have to multiply 2 times 5 to get 10, so I have to multiply the numerator also times 5. That would give me 45a. Minus, on the bottom, we have 5 times 2, so we have to multiply this times 2, and that would be minus 8a. Again, we have like terms on the top, so 45 minus 8 would be 37a divided by 10, and that's as far as you can go. This one is number 7. Common denominator would be 6a. So we're going to write 6a. In the first term, what do I have to multiply 3a by to get 6a? That would be multiplied times 2. We have a binomial, so we are going to multiply this binomial times 2. In order to do that, we're going to have to do the distributive property. So 2 times a is 2a, and 2 times 8 is 16. Moving to the next term, what do I multiply 2a by to get 6a? I'd multiply that times 3. So now I have to multiply this binomial times 3 again using the distributive property. So 3 times 5a would be 15a, and 3 times 4 would be 12. Last one, we actually have the same denominator, so I don't have to do anything with the numerator. I can just write 7a plus 2. Now we're going to look for like terms. We have 2a, 15a, and 7a. So that looks like it would be 24a. And then we have 16 plus 12, which is 28, plus 2 more, which would be 30. So that's 24a plus 30 on the top numerator. On the bottom we had 6a. Remember, this is a binomial, so I can't, it goes as a package deal. The only way I could simplify is to factor, factor, factor. So what could I factor out of the top? Each one of those is divisible by 6. So I factor out a 6. That would leave me 4a plus 5. And on the bottom we have 6a. So now we simply, the 6 and the 6 cancel each other left, and we're left with 4a plus 5 on the top and a on the bottom. Just remember that when you have a binomial, you can't, that's a package deal. You can't just start saying, oh, let's cancel this right here. You have to factor it first. then you can simplify what's outside of the binomial with what's outside the binomial. So this was part 1. There will be a part 2 lesson tomorrow. I hope this is helpful.